Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Cruising your way on this episode of Off 90. We meet an explorer from Good Thunder. We learn about the odd origins of a small town by Albert Lee. We chat with an unlikely Asian-style artist from Faribault. And we visit a museum with ties to Laura Ingalls Wilder in Spring Valley, Minnesota. It's all just ahead, Off 90. Hi, I'm Barbara Keith. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Off 90. Aaron Doering is hard to track down. He spends his time traveling the world, learning and educating. When he isn't out globetrotting, he's a professor at the University of Minnesota. Aaron is an educator, explorer, and author who has melded his affinity for educating with his love for world wandering. We caught up with Aaron just after he had given a presentation in Mankato.
Sometimes I just want to take my globe and spin it and put my finger down, and wherever I end up, that's where we're going. Yeah, so I'm Aaron Doering. I'm a professor of learning technologies at the University of Minnesota. And many times people call me an explorer because I have spent the last almost 20 years traveling to the most remote locations around the world. When I travel around the world, I get that question about what's my most memorable, what's my favorite place to be. And probably the most memorable is going to go way back to 2004. It was Arctic Transect 2004, one of my first expeditions. But that was a 6-month expedition, so you can imagine living in a tent at 30 below with the same people for 6 months. Was it my favorite? I don't know about that, but it was my most memorable. Some of my most favorite is to the Baffin Island of the Canadian Arctic in an area known as Nunavut. I also fell in love with South America when we did an expedition there in Nepal. I mean, there's just so many amazing places, and it's not only the place, but also the people. And so it's, there's a discussion around all that when we talk about favorites. When we travel to these remote locations or even talk to my grad students, people say, what is it that people don't understand? And I think one thing that I run into is that I'm in these places that have little contact with the outside world, even today in 2017. And so it's not that they don't understand something, it's that they don't have the opportunity to learn about something. And so if we can give them that opportunity, then truly their life will change. So you take an example of Nagi Village, which is it's outside of Pokhara in Nepal. And the individual I worked with there, he spent about 10 years working on how he could bring the internet into Nagi. And the reason he wanted to do that is because he didn't want to see the youth having to leave this village that he loved so much in order to have to go to school like he did when he was a child. And he completely transformed this entire community just because he was able to bring technology and the internet there, bringing online education and so on. I spent 7 years traveling the entire circumpolar Arctic by dog team, and the ability to know how to treat animals and how to interact with them, how to take care of them, that I was raised with, completely transcended into my work in the Arctic. Taking care of these dogs, not only on a physical level, but also on an emotional level, because it's all has to work together, because if the dogs aren't happy, you're not happy. And so you're taking care of them at night, you're digging holes that they can sleep in. And so all these aspects were very, very important to not only me on the expedition, but what I learned from growing up on the farm. What happened once is that one of the dogs was completely going off, one of the bear dogs, and I look outside the vestibule of the tent, and sure enough, literally less than 40 feet in front of me is this huge polar bear. And I yell polar bear, and my team members say something back to me that I can't repeat. But I go and grab, actually I grabbed the camera first, and then my teammate got really mad at me, and I grabbed the gun, and I went to shoot it, and it was a cracker shell. And a cracker shell is where it goes and explodes, but the issue was that the polar bear was so close that I shot the cracker shell over it and exploded on the other side. Where would I like to go next? Well, I need to get to Antarctica, and that is on my list of all the interviews I want to do at the scientific stations. And probably the next area is going to be more around the Indonesia area, just because I have a passion for that. The next trips are going to be not only to Iceland like we talked about, but we're going to Peru as part of the Changing Earth. We're going down the Mississippi as part of Ag Cultures and inspiring the youth in agriculture. So there's many expeditions ahead.
In the early 1900s, Hollandale, Minnesota was a marsh. Then along came a developer who figured out that if he drained the marsh, he could create a farming community and take advantage of the rich underlying peat soil. Hollandale thrived for a time, growing sugar beets, potatoes, onions, and other produce. The developer recruited people of Dutch ancestry, who he presumed would be good at raising produce in former marshes. We take a look at Hollandale today.
Hollandale is a little community between Albert Lea and Austin. It originally was a swamp, and they drained it and made it into a cropland and vegetable growing area for the Dutch. Hollandale started in 1918. A fellow by the name of Payne Investment Company, who was a land developer. He was from Omaha, Nebraska. And he purchased Hollandale, which is 15,000 acres of swampland. He had some engineers come in and look it over very careful and decided that it would be a good drainage project because it was peat ground. After it was drained, they could plant celery, carrots, potatoes, well, you name it. To drain a big marsh of 15,000 acres, it takes a large drag line to make an open ditch. They dug the ditch all the way from Austin, and they drained it with the smaller machines. The machine was a Buckeye road building drainage machine, 76 ton. It had a building on top of it where the crew would eat and sleep, and this machine ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
My father came from Holland in 1909 as a young man. They came to Hollandale in the 20s, and we ended up having 11 in our family. So I was born right here in Hollandale. I started at 8 out in the fields, at 8 years old. We weeded onions on our hands and knees, and along with us were the migrants that came from Texas or Mexico.
I came to Hollandale because I was born here. My dad and mother were raised in this area also. My grandparents came from Holland. 99 to 95% of the people that settled here were of Dutch heritage. Payne Investment Company was a sharp man. Wherever the Dutch were settled, he encouraged the Dutch to come to Hollandale. There was what they call a bungalow by Geneva Lake, which is just west of town here. If you wanted to buy land, you You come to Hollandale to the bungalow, and he would wine and dine you there. And the next day he'd take you out early in the morning on a little ride in this touring car, 1926 touring car, show you the land that is being developed, and you could just choose what you wanted to buy. And most people bought 20-acre plots because a 20-acre plot could support a family. We decided we needed a railroad come to town because they had to use trucks to ship their potatoes. In fact, they granted 2 permits, one with the Rock Island from Clark's Grove and one from south of Hollandale, which was the Milwaukee. And the governor was there, and people by the hundreds came. "60% of the people that raised potatoes and onions and carrots sold them to the local Hollandale Marketing Association. If a buyer wanted to buy potatoes, he had to come to the association.
I was the youngest of 11 children. Some of the older ones were out of the home. My mother had 1 helper in the house, and the rest of us went out to the fields at 7 in the morning till 6 at night. And we stayed there unless it was 100 in the shade or raining. We had a good education. Well, my husband started his own drainage business when he was 17.
My dad decided he wanted a little area drained. So finally I decided, well, I'll go down to Pella, Iowa and buy a little tiling machine and tile it out for my dad. And then the neighbors came over and they wanted to do some drainage. So for 50 years I've been draining for the neighbors. My mother was here in 1926 and a big storm came through, like 5 inches of rain. When you get a 5-inch rain in this area, we literally can't handle that. So therefore the water sits on top of the soil and drowns out the crop. And that has happened probably 5-6 times in my lifetime. That was the beginning of the end of some of the farmers. Some of the farmers decided that they wanted to sell their product without going through the association. And so the association slowly faded out. And pretty soon with the floods, had 2 to 3 years of flooding and then low prices and no demand for the potatoes from foreign markets like Chicago, they finally sold out.
We are now growing corn and soybeans in some of these areas.
I'd say that potatoes are probably 50% reduction, onions probably 75% reduction, carrots probably an increase of 30%. Some of the peat ground has deteriorated and has dropped 3 to 4 feet. Some of that land is being reversed back to marshes. The DNR is buying it and we're flooding it again.
So part of me is sad to see that, but on the other hand, we've had a good life, and here in Hollandale, I've loved it. It's a great place to grow up and great place to raise a family.
All it took was one brush. Dee Teller fell in love with Chinese art because of a sumi brush. This love has taken her to China and Toronto to study and has been rewarded by numerous international distinctions. Her specialties are horses and ancient calligraphy. We visit Dee at her home near Faribault for a lesson in art and laughter that this vibrant woman is only too happy to share.
I'm thinking I might add a few more very fine black lines on that. The calligraphy is fabulous, absolutely fabulous. I love it. I'm very proud of it. Looks good. That's a lot better than it was a few minutes ago. Take my word for it. Do you think I enjoy creating? Yeah, very much. Evidently, my mother thought I was an artist when I started school. Because I'm sure it was probably I wanted purple trees or, you know. My name is Dee Teller. I live on Cannon Lake in Faribault. I have been an artist since the beginning, I guess. Basically, I'm an Asian brush painter because I got hooked on the brush. I was getting my art BS in art from Mankato State. And one of the teachers of the watercolor class was Chinese. And she said, who wants to learn to use the sumi brush, which is the Asian brush, usually bamboo, animal hair. And so that's what led me to end up going to China and studying was the brush. I got hooked on the brush. The first time that I studied was at an art academy in Hangzhou, China. I met my horse master, Lockhart. He demonstrated the horse. The class wasn't supposed to paint it, but I went back, I painted a horse. So and then I was doing better than anybody else in the class. So he grabs me by the shoulder and he goes, "You must come live with me." So at the time I met him, his family lived in Toronto, and we would take turns. One summer, he and his family would come here for 3 weeks, and then the next year I would go to their place, and we did that for 17 years. So over the years, I have won 7 nationals on my horses and 1 on my calligraphy. In '92, I was invited by the Ministry of Culture in Beijing. It was an invitational competition. And I sent in a poem of calligraphy and I sent in a horse. And when I got the letter, I didn't know what it said. It was in Chinese. I had 2 Chinese ladies over for tea, and then they read the letter. And they're screaming and running around the house, "You have to go, you have to go." So we found out on Thursday that I had won 3rd place in the world. And that was 6,000 artists from 16 countries. So of course we had to go. But that was a huge, huge, huge honor. And the first thing the judges asked me, how you know to paint like Xu Beihong. I said, I'm a granddaughter of Xu Beihong. That was my teacher's teacher, you know. So that's why I won. It was because of my similarity in horse style to China's most famous horse painter, who is my grandfather in art. I received a grant from the Southeast Minnesota Arts Council and the McKnight Foundation, and I proposed to wander in Minnesota. That's an ancient Chinese way to paint and to write poems. So what they do is get on a horse, ride through the mountain for 7 days. Then they come home, write about that mountain or paint it. And so my suggestion was that I should wander in Minnesota and then use that landscape and put my horses in it. So I went to the Pipestone National Monument And then I did the North Shore. And the other place was the bluffs in the east, the bluff country. The painting that maybe is the favorite out of the 12 that I did of the public happens to be this waterfall that was at Pipestone. The most important thing about being an artist, believe it or not, is the process and how you feel. Once in a while, the results are magic. And part of it is you have like help from the angels. It isn't me all the time. I have a lot of help when I do this. So I guess it's just something kind of sings to you, whispers in your ear, and then you say, yeah, this is it. Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah, I've heard of that. This question, yeah. So I started high school at 12. So what? Cool.
For a small town, Spring Valley has boasted several notable residents. One of them was author Laura Ingalls Wilder, who lived in Spring Valley for a time. Another name you might recognize is Richard Sears, one of the founders of Sears, Roebuck and Company. We visit the Spring Valley Historical Society to find out more about these and other notable former residents.
The Methodist Church Museum was built in 1876, and of course that was at the time that the Wilders lived here. They were members of the church, and of course helped pay the debt of building that church. I'm Julie Maliner, and I'm the director for the Spring Valley Historical Society and Museums. Laura Ingalls Wilder, of course, was an author and wrote her series of 9 children's books, the Little House books. When the family ended up out in DeSmet, South Dakota, she was just Laura Ingalls. It was at the same time that 3 of the Wilder siblings headed out there to do homesteading. Almanzo met Laura Ingalls. They had a baby boy that died, and then they both got deathly sick with diphtheria. It was trying to heal from diphtheria is what brought them to Spring Valley, because Almanzo's family was living here. They had a huge home that had plenty of room for them to come and recuperate here. Also attended the church that the Wilders were members of. The one photo that we do have that's very special is a picture of the Wilder home. On the porch is Almanzo with his mother and father, and then his sister Eliza Jane is standing there. Also on the other porch is Laura and their daughter Rose. We do still have the barn here. That was a barn that was, of course, used by the Wilders for their Morgan horses. Some of the other notables that lived here, Richard Sears, who started Sears and Roebuck Catalog and the Sears stores. He did all of his schooling here in Spring Valley. Charlie Henderson was a tool and die maker by trade, but he loved to invent. And so we have many inventions that he has in the museum, one including the one-handed desk stapler that he invented, and because of that we did have a staple factory here in town. And also the silent shutter for the Connolly brothers. The Connolly brothers were 2 brothers that invented their own camera line, and so because of that we did have a camera factory here also. And of course Bernard Petenpole was a man that lived just south of town in Cherry Grove, developed his own kit that you could buy and of course make your own airplane, or an air camper as they were called. Probably the major reason that we believe that so many people were here is the fact that we had 2 rail lines that came through. The best thing about what I do is having people from around the world come to see what Laura, where she lived, what she did, the people that she lived with, the communities that she was a part of. People will come that had no idea that Laura lived in Spring Valley, Minnesota.
That's all for this episode. If you enjoy programs like Off 90, please show your support by becoming a member of KSMQ Public Television. Keep local programming vibrant in southern Minnesota. Give us a call at 507-481-2095 or 1-800-658-2539 or sign up online at ksmq.org. Thanks for watching. Join us next time, Off 90.
Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.